And now I'd like to invite Lisa McCory to come up and light our chalice today. As we prepare for that, those of you online, you'll be invited to light a chalice at home, if you have one, or a candle. And I invite you here in the sanctuary to rise in body or spirit and speak aloud our affirmation, printed in the Zoom for those online and on the back of your service for those here in the service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve human need. For these high purposes do we unite in worship.
You who feel your heart is breaking, come in. You who are confused and wondering, come in. You who are angry, in pain, or not wanting to be here, come in. You who are hopeful and energized, come in. Bring your broken heart and your grief. Bring your confusion and your questions. Bring your anger and your pain. Bring your hope and your energy.
So friends, we all know this is Martin Luther King weekend, celebrated since 1983. Had King lived, he would be 94 today. Even as we see his influence all around, many of his goals for racial justice still remain unfulfilled. Today, I want to reflect on an event central to both King's legacy and Unitarian Universalists: the events of civil rights demonstrations on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. And some of you may realize that Selma has been in the news this weekend because of inordinate flooding after storms in Selma. So that Selma is what I'm talking about in this sermon. Another important American central to events in Selma was John Lewis. He enjoyed longer life than King did. He died in 2020 at the age of 80. As we hold this annual recognition of King and Lewis and the many other brave individuals who risked their lives for freedom and equality for all Americans, I hope these celebrations can inspire our own justice-making. Indeed, Lewis's call for us to make good trouble, I love his words, make good trouble, is a heartfelt reminder of our obligations to stand up for discrimination and oppression anywhere we can. Both King and Lewis were deeply religious, both ordained ministers. They called on their preaching skills to motivate audiences to both tears and actions. Their legacies remind us to include justice-making in our identities as people of faith. Justice-making requires faith because the work is never done. Not only were King and Lewis of deep faith, that faith called them to promote justice in race, class, economics, worker rights, and more through principles of nonviolence. Nonviolence is the subject of the workshop here this afternoon, appropriately called Building Bridges, on this Sunday when here in worship we're focusing on a bridge in Selma. Some of us might welcome tomorrow as a day off, but rather than only time off, I hope everyone will do something to remember King and Lewis. Surely we'll have a chance to hear one of King's famous passages, such as Letter from Birmingham Jail or his I Have a Dream speech, both of those from 1963. Perhaps there's some community action to get involved with. Mary and I have been checking out. We understand there's a number of events at Fort Lewis College tomorrow for you to gather together in, and there's a filming tomorrow night of the movie Selma, a showing of the film Selma. So try to get involved tomorrow. Do something to remember King and Lewis, and contribute to the community. The justice-making models from King and Lewis continue to influence our work today. How many Americans have learned from them as we initiated new standards in race relations, such as Black Lives Matter, or the call these past few years to dismantle white supremacy? Within Unitarian Universalism, our current project called Widening the Circle, spearheaded by the Commission on Institutional Change, surely would not exist if we didn't have models for justice-making, as we learned from both King and Lewis. Martin Luther King had close relationships with Unitarian Universalists. So if you didn't know about that before, I hope you take to heart the story I'm going to tell about his connection with Unitarian Universalists. Unitarian Universalists collaborated with King in Selma in March 1965, just 4 years after this denomination was founded. Events in Selma helped this young denomination, which then consisted mostly of white people of relative privilege. Unfortunately, some of the positive lessons Unitarian Universalists learned in Selma wore thin rather quickly. By the late 1960s, this denomination was tangled in serious disagreements over race. Still, in 2015, Unitarian Universalists went back to Selma on the 50th anniversary of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Perhaps that experience offered some necessary groundwork for a major pivot in denominational race relationships in 2017, which in turn led to revelatory initiatives in race relations among Unitarian Universalists. We are in a new mode of race relations in this denomination. Speaking for myself, I joined other UUs in 2015 on that walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I know that that event, friends, forever changed my understanding of power created when people of liberal faith indeed come together to make good trouble. Walking across that bridge was a life-changing event. So let's review the story of Selma in 1965. I'm curious how many of you already know something of this story. I hope you'll come away with a whole lot better understanding of it. For me, the word Selma has come to mean both a city and an event, a new location I visited, and a new state of my soul. Let's also put events in Selma in the context of the history timeline that we worked on last week. This congregation was founded 2 years after 1965, as we learned last week. 2 years after the march in Selma, and then 1 year before King's assassination in 1968. So situate this congregation within this timeline. The story of Selma has been well reported in a book by my colleague and my friend Mark Morrison Reed, a book called Selma Awakening. I don't know how effective it is for me to show books, but I think to show the tangible object can perhaps invite some of you to get a copy of the book yourself and have a read. So Selma Awakening, a really good story, interpretation of events in Selma. My colleague offers fresh interpretations of liberal religion in this country leading up to 1965 and how Selma influenced Unitarian Universalists going forward. Here's Mark Morrison Reed's primary thesis in this book, which I invite you to take to heart. He noted that there has often been a disconnect between Unitarian Universalists' espoused values, that is, the values we say we stand for in theory, and our practiced values. That is, how we actually treat one another in real life from day to day. And he uses this thesis to help interpret events both before and after events in Selma in 1965. So espoused values versus lived values. Consider the balance between the two. I wonder if that thesis could be applied to congregations. In this congregation, are the values and the identities you declare yourselves to be grounded on in principle evident in your real-life interactions from day to day? I suggest this is something for you, for all of us to think about, espoused versus practiced values. Let's review a few of the events leading up to Selma in 1965. After World War II, Unitarians and Universalists were recovering from the atrocities of the war, and they worked to promote racial justice in the American South. Their advocacy paralleled well racial justice programs of King and Lewis in the 1950s. The year 1963 saw King's famous letter from Birmingham jail and also the March on Washington, a peaceful gathering which many Unitarian Universalists attended. In 1964, King received the Nobel Peace Prize, and Lyndon Johnson was elected president after filling John Kennedy's term. And even though racial tension ran high, initially President Johnson didn't want to pass voting rights. It took events in Selma to convince him to do so. So in early 1965, King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference established their base for voting rights in the small Alabama city of Selma. It's not much of a city at all. I was surprised when I visited how small it was, because it looms so large in history. On Sunday, March 7th, a 50-mile march was planned from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, to protest the death in the Selma campaign, the first death of 26-year-old African-American activist named Jimmy Lee Jackson. At the Edmund Pettus Bridge, violence erupted. John Lewis was beaten. He sustained a skull fracture. He said he thought he was going to die there. Hundreds were tear gassed, putting the march to Montgomery on hold. Early Monday morning then, March 8th, King reached out to colleagues around the country. He sent the telegram that I read earlier. He called clergy of all faiths to join him in Selma. He personally appealed to several UU ministers he knew personally from graduate school at Boston University. So word among the UU ministers spread quickly, and by Tuesday morning, 45 UU clergy and 15 lay members were among the hundreds with King in Selma, just 24 hours later. Some of my dearest minister colleagues were among them. Some of these UUs were newly married, they had young families, they didn't have the time or the money, but they went to Selma anyway. Following afternoon rallies on that Tuesday, a group of UU ministers had dinner at Walker's Cafe, a local Selma hangout for blacks and their white allies. A dozen UU ministers were crowded around the cafe's tiny tables. Really, I've been there, I've seen the cafe. Tiny, crowded, cramped space. Among them was Clark Olson, Orloff Miller, and James Reeb, who left the restaurant together to go to King's event that evening. Walking to King's rally, they were clubbed by 4 or 5 local thugs, white thugs. Olson and Miller said they heard the club connecting to Jim Reeb's head. All 3 were injured, but Reeb the most seriously. He managed to walk to Southern Christian Leadership Conference headquarters, which was around the corner, but it was clear his condition was dire. If the clubbing and the subsequent events weren't so tragic, they play like a comedy of errors, my friends. Only a black infirmary in Selma would accept voting rights activists. Jim Reeb needed to be moved to a hospital in Montgomery. The only available ambulance was for blacks only, which had a flat tire on the way that they didn't dare change on the roadside. They secured a second ambulance, but they had to wait for escort because travel for any civil rights workers was threatening. They finally reached the hospital in Montgomery at 11 p.m. on Tuesday evening. News of this attack spread quickly, especially through the UU community. Think of the heartbreak. The wife of one of the ministers in Walker's Cafe heard on the 11 p.m. news that a group of ministers had been attacked. She had an hour of panic until she was able to confirm that her husband was safe. She also learned that the injuries of Jim Reeb were fatal. The hospital waited for his wife, Marie, to fly from Boston to remove life support. Sadly, Jim Reeb died in the early hours of Thursday, March 11th. In their meantime, through this shock, other UU ministers in Selma were called to intense decision-making. You can just imagine. You can imagine the shock. My friend, the Reverend Dave Johnson, who was then a rookie minister who had driven to Selma, became the official chauffeur for some of the ministers. Dave recalled one planning meeting for Reeb's memorial, which Martin Luther King attended. As you can imagine, the depth of racial tension and the risk to all the activists was on everyone's mind. During these same days, the National Board of the Unitarian Universalist Association was meeting in Boston. On news of Jim Reeb's death, the board recessed and reconvened in Selma. By Monday, March 15th, 109 UU ministers, including the UUA president, Dana Greeley, who is the name on the certificate acknowledging the beginning of this congregation in 1967. You can see Dana Greeley's signature over in the office. Dana Greeley gathered with the other ministers and with Martin Luther King to eulogize Jim Reeb. That same day, President Johnson introduced a Voting Rights Act to Congress in words that remind us that it was not only Unitarian Universalism changed that day, it was the United States as well. This is what President Johnson declared. At times, history and fate meet in a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord, so it was a century ago at Appomattox, so it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There, long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed, unquote, words by President Johnson. My friends, let us pray it will not take any more deaths to convince politicians of the urgency of maintaining and continuing to work on voting rights in this country. A few days after Jim's memorial, a federal judge ruled that the march from Selma to Birmingham, which had been put on hold, could go forward, and offered state and federal protection to the marchers. 300 marchers were anticipated on Sunday, March 21st, but by the end, 30,000 people marched to Montgomery, including 500 UU congregants and 250 ministers, a third of all the ministers who were then in fellowship. 250 showed up. Unfortunately, tragedy struck again. After marchers reached Birmingham, they had to be ferried back to Selma. When they reached Montgomery, they had to be ferried back to Selma. Even with responsibilities as a mother of 5, a woman named Viola Liuzzo from Detroit came to Selma to support King. While driving marchers back to Selma, she was shot in the head at point-blank range by 4 Ku Klux Klansmen, and she died instantly. At UUA headquarters today, you can see plaques devoted to her, to Jim Reeb, and to Jimmy Lee Jackson. In the immediate aftermath, The experience in Selma brought moral clarity, as one minister observed, to Unitarian Universalism. The Unitarian Universalist denomination was transformed through this collaboration with Martin Luther King. In return for support in Selma, in 1966, King accepted the invitation as the Ware Lecturer, which is the most honorific speaking spot at the annual General Assembly. So King joined the assembly in 1966. And our press, Beacon Press, became the official publisher of his papers, still today. It's Beacon who holds the rights to King's materials. Unfortunately, by the end of the 1960s, various justice issues embroiled Unitarian Universalists. Vietnam had come along. Vietnam was extremely divisive in this denomination. And then there was a financial crisis in the denomination. And then there was an event called the Empowerment Controversy, which was serious issues, serious disagreements over race relations. I can talk about the Empowerment Controversy in another sermon. So we had this moment of clarification and coming together around events in Selma, but unfortunately it didn't last long. I invite you to imagine yourself as a Unitarian Universalist in 1965. Would you have gone to Selma? Why? Why walk into dangerous situations? What does a civil rights march have to do with being a person of faith? Viola Liuzzo told her husband she had to go. "It's everybody's fight," she said. And Jim Reeves said the same. He said it was the kind of fight he believed in. They each had young children back home. Yes, there were tragic outcomes, but the experience in Selma also stimulated new hope for racial justice among Unitarian Universalists. Unfortunately, what did not change much was the nearly total lack of racial diversity in this historically white, upper middle class denomination. It wasn't until the year 2001 that Unitarian Universalists elected the first Black national president, William Sinkford. And some of you may recall last week Ken Carpenter spoke up proudly to say he served on Bill Sinkford's campaign to become the first president of color in this denomination. We did continue to make some progress. In 2009, Unitarian Universalists elected the first Latino president, Peter Morales, who I also understand has visited this congregation. And in 2017, we elected the first woman. And at the General Assembly in 2023, we anticipate electing the first Black woman president of this denomination. Yes, yes, yes. While recently UUs have made some good progress in race relationships and anti-oppression, there's still more to do. Taking one small step at a time, we can make this world a safer place. Why did I go to Selma in 2015? Admittedly, there was some danger, even 50 years later on the anniversary. I went to Selma, my friends, because I had to. Walking across that bridge, I came away forever changed in understanding how justice making is integral to my identity as a person of liberal faith. I had to go to better understand the stories my late colleague, the Reverend David Johnson, used to tell. I wanted to understand the tears he shed 50 years later whenever he recalled the tragedy. I wanted to understand better how Selma changed the lives of so many ministers and so many Americans. I had to go to Selma to gain more perspective on the complexities of human nature, to gain insight from the paradox that some of the UU ministers who attended demonstrated the capacity to stand proudly for civil rights in Alabama, and yet lived lives back in their congregations that violated marriage covenants and personal boundaries. I had to go to Selma to understand the complexities of people of faith. I had to go to Selma because As a song by Sweet Honey and the Rock says, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." The work of freedom, my friends, is the work of each of us. We cannot rest until all are free. May all this be so.